In this video, I will run through all the settings that I have changed for my macro photography as well as birding and mammals. And then we will save these settings to our custom modes for future use. To begin with, let us change the mode dial to the mode we want to use for macros. In my case, I shoot full manual, so I have already set the dial to the M for manual mode. And now I will reset my camera settings so we can run through all the settings that I changed. Okay, so we go into reset initialize settings, all settings, and as you can see, the help tells you that it will not reset everything, including the date. So let's reset all settings. One of the things that is not reset is the copyright information. If I turn this on, which is okay for me, these fields are not reset. So if you're using a settings file from someone else, just make sure the copyright information is as you would want. The other thing that is not reset or reinitialized is your wireless settings. They also remain exactly the same and everything works as expected. And now let's start with the menus. In case you need any help with any menu option, simply press the info button and it will tell you what the option does. Okay, first thing that I change is the save format. I set it to RAW. If you're new to the OM-1, you might want to turn the image review to auto. This does not interfere with your continuous shooting. Okay, next page. We just switch this off. White balance for flash mode, 5500 Kelvin. The last option here we change to off. This is optional, you can put it to detail priority. And we move on to this metering during sequential shooting, that is generally not required. The drive mode I set to mechanical continuous, which we will change to anti-shock. Sequential shooting settings allows you to change the frame rates and disable options that you do not use. Anti-shock I turn on. The description tells you what it does. Basically, it's a combination of the electronic shutter and the mechanical. Silent settings is when you're using the electronic shutter, which will be used if you're focus stacking or bracketing. Since I use a flash for all my macro shots, I will always allow the flash mode. The rest of the settings are fine. Next page, you might want to set this to IS priority. And then we move on to the next camera menu. These are all the computational modes. We don't really have to change anything here for now. In the AF menu, we set it to continuous autofocus. I change this to on. AF by half pressing the shutter release by default is on for both modes, which is fine. I also set this to on and this to off, since I do not want any out of focus shots. Illuminator I do not want. Area pointer, if you want more information, you can set it to on too. These buttons, the AF I change to target priority, and this I turn off. We're not going to use any of these for now. In the video AF mode, I would recommend that you set it to AF plus tracking. If you do not have tracking, you will not be able to select any subject detection modes. Next menu, we have not much to change here. In the MF assist, you might want to turn on peaking as well as focus indication for the direction. MF clutch I always keep to inoperative. And since I always shoot in manual, I change this to manual. Once again, warm colors we will switch off. The noise filter for video, you might want to keep it at high if you're shooting in low light or conditions where you might generate noise. In sound recordings, since we are generally talking of shooting outdoors, wind noise reduction can be set to standard. If you're using a microphone external, then if it requires power, you can turn it on here. Nothing to change here. We move on to the playback menu. The quick erase I set to on. Button settings are purely a matter of choice. I set the exposure compensation to SOVF, that is the simulated optical viewfinder mode. The record button I set to subject detection, and I change this to the center option, which allows us to use the arrow keys for shortcuts. For macros, I set this to focus stacking, and I set the second button to focus bracketing. So that's the setup for my button assignments for macros. I always use the shutter release for video recording, so I switch this on. For video, I will also reprogram the record button for subject detection and also turn this on so we can use some of the arrow functions. Okay, so we move on to the function lever settings. This is how I switch from stills to video. I always select mode 3, which allows me to simply switch to video from stills and still to video just by switching the function lever. Priority set, if you make this yes, by default all options where you need to answer queries will default to yes. Menu cursor, I generally put it to save so I land up in the same place. Nothing much to change here. EVF style I set to 3. Now info settings, I only use 2 panels and I make sure that the second panel has silent operation enabled. What this does is allows you to use your touch screen, your back LCD, to touch and change ISO, shutter speed and aperture. We do not need to do this for the video since the touchscreen is already enabled in that. The other important option is info by half pressing the shutter release. I set this to off because I do not want any distractions in the frame while I am shooting. I want a clean frame just like it used to be in the DSLRs. Next, grid settings. The default grid is not really visible, so instead of changing that, I just set it to preset 2. For some, the color of preset 2 is fine and you can leave it there. For me, I change it to green. I prefer setting it to green, so I remove the reds, set green and change alpha to a full 100. We're done with the grid. Now I have 2 SD cards on it. For video, I set it to record on the second SD card, and save settings, I use auto switch. So once card 1 is full, it'll switch to the other one. File name should always be auto, otherwise you might risk overwriting previous files on import. Eye sensor settings is another important one. Behavior when switched should not be maintain screen, it should be shooting screen. So whenever you get the camera to your eye, it's ready to shoot and not playing back what you are looking at. Sound I do not want, so I switch it off. Airplane mode I generally turn on to preserve battery unless I require the Bluetooth for some reason. I also turn on quick sleep mode to preserve battery on occasion. And that's it for the settings, the menu settings. Let's go back to the shooting screen and press OK for the super control panel. Now the shooting mode can only be set by rotating the mode dial. I've already done that. So by default, the shutter speed is set to 1/250th of a second, which is totally fine as far as macros are concerned. This is the sync speed for the flash when we use the mechanical shutter. For the f-stop, I will start at somewhere around maybe f10 or 11. I do not use auto ISO, so I will switch it to the base ISO of 200. The rest is something that we've already set up and is totally fine. Now that we are done with all these settings, let's press the menu to go back into the menu. And camera menu 1, custom mode, C1, assign, set. Now this is set for our macro photography. Now that we have our macro shooting settings, let's make the changes for shooting birds. Press OK to get into the super control panel. The default shutter speed I start with is 1600th of a second. Depending on the weather and conditions, I might shoot at f5.6, 6.3, 7.1 or 8. Depending on your needs, you can set the default f-stop to whatever is more convenient for you. I generally start with an ISO of 800 and I change the small to a cross type, and the shutter release I set to silent sequential or SH2 depending on what I'm shooting and where. So once we have all these settings, now remember that we programmed the record button to select subjects. So I'm just going to press the record button and turn the dial back or front and select birds. Now that we have the basic settings for shooting birds, we press the menu, go back into our custom mode, C2, assign and set. So we have custom settings for birding and macros. Now what if you wanted to shoot mammals? Just use the birding settings, press the record button and rotate the dial and select dogs and cats. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Now, if you selected a mode different from manual for birding and macros, keep in mind that you will have to use the mode dial to switch to C1 and C2. If, like me, you are shooting birds and macros in the manual mode, then you do not need to use the dial at all. Simply go into the menu, custom mode, and switch to whatever custom settings you want. And we are back to macros. That's it for now. Have fun till the next one.